Hello and welcome to Gifts of the Completed Life. My name is Lynn Barger Elliott, and today we will continue the Transitions and Transformation series, where we will explore what I call the in-between spaces. It's my pleasure to welcome back Mark Barger Elliott, the Executive Director of the Completed Life Initiative. Thanks for joining us, Mark.
Thanks, Lynn. It's always great to join you on this podcast.
Life is full of transitions, times when we find ourselves in that space between where we were and where we are going. Yet in this place, gifts of the completed life can be discovered. A completed life, as Aristotle once observed, can be measured in terms of time, meaning that when we die, our life is complete. But he also suggested that a completed life can be made up of a sequence of moments throughout our lives of happiness and meaning, moments that feel wholehearted, as if all that we are is present in that very second. These are the moments we will explore in this podcast, for they are the gifts of the completed life. In our first episode, we talked about that in-between place, when we find ourselves between the tides. As the waters ebb and flow around our feet, we considered three gifts of the completed life: the gift of life unsealed, the gift of predictable unpredictability, and the gift of creation in the cross currents. In our second episode, we talked about the gifts of the scent of perfume and the heart's desire to heal, especially in the transition between our life and our death. Today, in our final episode of Transitions, we will consider how and when we know it's time to leave the liminal space. What are the outward and inward signs nudging us to step out of the in-between space towards the place we are going? Anna Erickson was a friend of mine from graduate school. She grew up on a small vineyard in Washington State and would share stories about how and when they knew the grapes were ready to be harvested. She described how her dad would suddenly put out calls to alert the family, the neighbors, anyone he could gather. It was time to rush to the vineyard for the harvest. It was, as she put it, a drop everything and meet me in the vineyard moment. Now, I always thought you could plan a grape harvest, but according to Anna's stories, it's more complex than that, and in some ways, more simple. Yes, there are harvest seasons. You can estimate grapes will need to be picked sometime between late June to mid-August. But I learned that the precise timing matters. And one never really knows when that time will come until a few signs appear. And then it was a matter of hours. What are those signs? Every day, Anna's father would walk through his rows of grapes. He would take a look at their color. A ripening grape begins to quickly change color. That was the first sign. Then he would lightly tug at the grape. Did it cling to the vine, or would it release easily? The second sign. Then he would study the stem. Was it starting to turn a shade of brown, for example, showing signs of drying up? And perhaps most importantly, he would look up. Were the birds starting to swoop in? That was the telltale sign the grapes were ready. Somehow they sensed by sight or smell a feast was about to be served. Anna said on a moment's notice, her father would ring the bell, metaphorically or maybe literally, alerting everyone they were needed in the vineyard for the harvest. The timing made all the difference between an abundant or a weak harvest. This story has remained with me over the years, I think for two reasons. First, I was struck by those signs, these external cues, alerting Anna's father that a transition was happening. The harvest didn't just occur one day. There were outward signs communicating that change was happening around them. The color of the fruit, the strength of the vine, the birds and the air. Every day her father would look and watch to see if anything was changing, if the transition was coming. This story also reminded me that timing is important. For a long time, nothing happened, and then subtle changes were occurring, and it was time to act. It was time to harvest the grapes.
Lynn, I really like that idea of like we wait and we watch, and then we wait and we watch longer. And then somehow suddenly the world around us begins to change ever so slightly, like you put it. Like the sun rises earlier this week than it did last week. The morning light announces itself in like this most beautiful way. Like sometimes in our neighborhood, like a sidewalk is closed and then we have to walk home another way. And when we do that, like you and I, we notice gardens and we say hello no to neighbors that we never knew, like lived just around the corner. Or like you and I take an elevator up to our apartment and like we'll meet the same person 3 days in a row, but then finally we'll ask like, well, how's your day going? Or like we have a friend who, after receiving like a year of treatments, the doctor will say, you don't need to return for 3 months. Something changed. That like these gifts from outside, like you put it, they begin to tell us, they inform us. We no longer belong in that space, if that's what I hear you saying. That is time to leave, like that grape on the vine in your friend's vineyard.
Yeah. When I was working on this episode and thinking about Anna's family vineyard, my mind kept going back to an illustration I've heard you share before. It is the one about the poet David White. His story, if I remember it correctly, gives insight that yes, signs that a time of transition is coming to an end can be external, like the color of the grape or birds in the air. Signs can also be internal.
Yeah, David White is one of my favorite poets. That's the story I think you're referencing. It. Yeah, David's Irish. I think he now lives in the state of Washington. And the thing is, he wasn't always a poet. And in this book that I really enjoy, the title is Crossing the Unknown Sea, Work as a Pilgrimage of Identity. Well, he sort of pulls back the curtain and we get to experience how that transformation occurred in his own life. And it begins with this Benedictine monk. His name is David Stendhal Rast. And he was in this Benedictine monastery for like 14 or 15 years in California. He won an award for building dialogue between religious transitions. He was a good writer. And for the purpose of this story, he was David White's friend. And the story continues between the two of them over poetry and wine. That was their kind of friendship. And as White tells it in the book, before his guest arrived, before David Stendhal Rast arrived, David White, the person we're talking about here, dropped into a chair, he writes, and looked at the unopened bottle of wine. and the sea and the sky that was in front of him. And he suddenly could feel how entirely exhausted he was in body and spirit. White says that Brother David Rost was his kind of monk. He was no stranger to silence, as he puts it. He was compassionate, but he challenged you when you needed to be challenged. And so after they opened that bottle and they took the first sip of wine, David White looked over at Brother David and blurted out, "Brother David, tell me about exhaustion."
Mm.
And David White writes, "So he looked at me as if he had been waiting all along to say this life-changing thing to me. And he said in a form of both a question and an assertion," writes David White, "you know that the antidote to exhaustion is not necessarily rest."
Hmm.
The antidote to exhaustion is not necessarily rest. David White then repeated, "Well, what is it then?" Well, Brother David continued, "The antidote to exhaustion is feeling wholehearted." He continued, You are so tired through and through because you're only half there, David, and half there will kill you after a while. You need something to which you can give your full powers. You know what that is. I don't have to tell you," said Brother David to David White. And this was White's moment of transition. It was his time, as you put it, Lynn, to leave the in-between space. So then Brother David went on to explain, moving out of that halfway place, the space in between, well, that takes courage. And the word courage in English comes from this old French word, cœur, which means heart. You must do something heartfelt, David, and you must do it soon.
His complete moment.
Yeah, like you put it at the beginning of the podcast. And then Brother David Stendhal Ross continued, "David," he said, "you have already ripened. Your exhaustion is a form of inner fermentation. You are beginning," he said, "ever so slowly to rot on the vine."
Mm.
White says he had this involuntary shiver when he heard that image. He described it as a prospect of an early death experienced while still alive. And is it that moment that David White decided he had to, like you were describing, pluck himself off the vine? But in this case, the sign wasn't outward like with your friend's vineyard, it was inward. And he needed to pay attention to what was happening inside of him. And from that moment, from that very conversation with his friend, David White decided to publicly call himself a poet, which was a strange thing to do. It was a career change for him. He quit his job, and then as years passed, now today he's one of our most beloved modern poets.
Well, that story has always stuck with me. It's such a graphic, almost unsettling image of rotting on a vine. It's the opposite of my friend's vineyard, but in both cases, I hear the time comes for a transition. The in-between time is done. It's over, and something is waiting to welcome us forward. Life is full of transitions, times when we will find ourselves in those in-between spaces. But we're not meant to stay there. That's the promise and the potential of the completed life. The time will come, likely a precise time, a completed moment, when we will need to courageously, wholeheartedly step out of our liminal space We might see, feel, experience signs that this is happening around us or even inside of us. And with these completed moments, these gifts, we can step away. We can pluck ourselves from the vine with a whole heart and leave that in-between space. Thank you for joining us for Gifts of the Completed Life, Transitions and Transformations. And thank you to Zoe Wilshire, the editor of the Completed Life podcast. We invite you to join us for our next episode as we consider the gift of transformation. To listen to other episodes of Gifts of the Completed Life or our other podcast series, Voices of the Completed Life, you can find us on your favorite podcast platform or visit our website, completedlife.org, and go to the Programs tab and scroll down. We would love to hear from you. Please send us your reflections, comments, and ideas of gifts or your stories of the completed life by emailing us at info@completedlife.org.